Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am joined today with the lovely Stephen Sillett. So, for those of you who know Stephen, great guy, a lot of knowledge in a lot of different things, metaphorical and otherwise. I asked him, "What should we call you for today?" And he said, He's innovative in creative spatial activities." Now, I met Stephen through the Metaphors of Movement work, and Stephen has done things like social panoramas, constellations, metaphors of movement, mindscaping, clean language, and he's currently doing a lot of interesting stuff with space for communities and teams and organizations. So I thought, let's have a chat about everything metaphor, see what comes up, and we'll go from there. So thank you for joining me, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So let's come back to some of the stuff you've been telling me you've been doing recently. So you say you've been doing a lot of work with teams, community. So how does you sort of mix the spatial stuff with teams, and how do you sort of incorporate the sort of all the knowledge that you've got together? I'm curious.
Yeah, so one of the things that does become quite interesting is how to work across different kind of contexts, different kinds of scales. A lot of this work that I originally started getting into was when we were doing some participatory theatre out in South Africa a few years ago.
Okay.
And there's something called there's a participatory theatre play, or called a forum theatre, where basically you do the play and you do it a second time, and the audience can replace a character, come up on stage and show how things could be different. So what we found is when we were trying to do this with the local communities in a rural area of South Africa, is the youth were quite nervous about getting involved. It's quite a didactic kind of system that they were sort of coming from. So we did a 3-day workshop that was before the actual play to sort of just open the youth up, and it involved then mapping out what we called mapping Ingravuma at the very beginning. Ingravuma being the town that they lived in, or that area. And they made stories on there. And this process kept developing between 2006. And we had teams going out to schools, running this workshop for 3 days, and then doing the play afterwards. But it was night and day in terms of the participation in the play after doing the workshop. So that was how we got into a lot of working with fabrics, and some of that's now, I'm going to speak a bit later. I've got some of those here. That get used in other stuff. But so how does that relate to what I'm doing now? Yeah, go on. What were you going to say?
No. So from what I've understood is you were putting together these performances, and I get a sense it's like improv. Like you put on a play that's got a relative structure, and then you invite the audience to take on the role, play the different people. But there were sort of challenges with the youth doing that. So you did these sort of workshops. So you said you map stuff out. So how does that, because you're using mental space, or like the physical space, so to speak. So how does that sort of work with what you've been doing?
Well, what was interesting was the participants, they do their own fabric map in that particular workshop. So there's basically, and this has now rolled across all of my creative spatial activities, is there was a very important setup to creating the space for exploration and discovery. Okay, so in that workshop that I said in South Africa, it was about their physical geography. So we set them up on the first day. The second day, they would map out their physical geography with fabrics in and then they would find places and make stories, and it would be around the theme. So the theme would be, in one case, was peer influence in the schools. Another instance we did with Oxfam Australia was around water issues. But the key thing was that it wasn't about them mapping to make it accurate. It was about mapping to put what resonated.
So just to clarify, when you say mapping their environment, so the way I think about it is, I mean, we're from like a similar place in the southeast England, and you've got like Erith, you've got Dartford. So essentially, if I was there and if I was in a school or in an activity, what I'd do is I would say, well, this bit of fabric represents Dartford. This represents maybe the Thames that comes. So would it be like mapping out their geography like that?
Yeah, exactly. And we tend to work out, when it's a school, you work out from the school. So basically, if you had someone, from Sevenoaks, and then they came to Erith but didn't know Erith, it wouldn't make sense, right? So it's people from that area who know that area. So we did this at different schools, for instance, in South Africa, and then they would map out from that school as far as you could go with that theme. So you know, it might be in terms of water access, it might be where they're trying to access water in that area. With the peer influence, it was much more like different areas of the school and areas around the school, and then they would start to stand in the map, and they would start to embody. And this is where this idea of something called a social topography came up. So the idea of being immersed in this felt landscape, and starting to feel what the qualities are of that particular landscape in relation to the theme. So that was this idea of socio-drama topography. So it became socio-drama being this kind of interactive work, which sort of leads into the play that was shown a couple of days later. But this socio-drama topography is like this felt landscape, and it was actually in coming up with that name and searching around for that name that I discovered social panoramas. And
cool.
I just got that book and then started getting into it through that. That's 2008.
Interesting. So, I mean, coming back to like metaphors of movement or clean language, essentially the person is at the center point of their experience. Metaphors is a bit more direct, and obviously clean language uses clean questions. But essentially from that school example, I mean, you don't have to do the school, but obviously that's the center, and then you're working out from that sphere of experience. Why do you use different material? Like, I mean, you could just paper or get them to draw it. Why do you choose to use material?
Yeah, exactly. So the use of material sort of evolved. Initially, actually, it was chalk on the ground, and material was sort of a way. When we did a project with Health Canada, we were trying to record some of what we were doing, so as to make it easier to photograph, but actually started to say, well, wait a sec, this is interesting, because I showed it to someone. She was actually a visual sociographer, and I said, oh, I was almost apologizing for this map. You know, it's like, well, you know, we're trying to do a proper map. You know, we're sort of doing it with what we got. And she's going, why are you apologizing? And I said, what? Well, it's not so clearly like a map. She says, but they know what it is. And I said, yeah. I said, they know what that fabric is. They know why that fabric happens to be there. They might not be able to say it. So there's a whole load of, so that really made me realize this idea that there's meaning on the inside that I can't see on the outside. And just to say that that sort of doubles up over there, because these workshops were being done in Zulu language, not in English. But that idea of being on the inside actually does tie into the metaphors of movement and that, because it's about the person's experience on the inside, and the person on the outside is to facilitate that. It's not the problem to be solved, is not helping the person on the outside know what it's all about, if that makes sense. And I think that was where there was kind of I think there was a natural way that this was sort of drawing me into this work.
That's really interesting. So if I'm understanding correctly, because if people draw, for example, there's an expectation how good the drawing is, these kind of stuff, or is it quite right? But if you have a clump of material, now obviously the different types of materials have different textures, have different colors, and from maybe an archetypal or a symbolic thing, I mean, from a metaphors of movement, I can just think, okay, I can idiomize those specific textures, those fabrics, those specific styles to create that understanding if I wanted to. But it means that there's ultimately more freedom, because as much as the material is symbolizing something, it's content free as to the meaning of what that is. Is that making sense?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, yes, I agree. And it would be interesting to idiomize a bit more with that, actually, because it hasn't been done that much, but I can see it fitting in. So for instance, I'll show you some of the fabrics here.
Yeah.
You know, this is blue. So you see, this one's got sort of a texture. We actually use this more in the immersive theatre venue before we go and do the activity. Some of these processes from back then in South Africa of what, like 10 years later, became what's happening now. So this is still slightly, this is maybe a little bit prescriptive. But so this fabric here, you see,
it's like sparkly. Yeah,
sparkly. It's got a lot of texture. There's a lot going on there, right? So one of the things that actually came out, and this is another one, which is quite nice, because you can go in. So some of these are nice because as you're doing it, you can go in. So we actually hang these up. We have when we do it, we have a mesh. Well, okay, I'm mixing up the two. let's stick to let's just stick with where we are at the moment. Is we're just using these fabrics. I didn't have as many of the fabrics as I've got now back then, but we did leave some fabric kits with them out there. The idea of just being inside, doing it from the inside, and finding a way to make meaning from the inside and for them to own it. So, and in a way, that I call it non-directive facilitation. Well, it's not me. It's the term non-directive facilitation, particularly with groups, was really what I was quite interested in. And
would you say that it's potentially a mixture of a clean language approach, essentially not imposing or looking to present meaning or communicate meaning, but then offering something more physical and more tangible in which to create that expression?
Yeah, it is, because one of the key things is that there's something called large group interventions, where you deliberately have 15, 20 or more people. And the idea is once you get in a group over 15, you don't know who's there. And that's actually a part of the design, not a defect. So then there's a kind of an anonymity when people are putting stuff around the landscape. So then, when we make this map, people put down on papers, the children were putting down a peer influence for a boy, a peer influence for a girl, at different hotspots around the space. They would look at those. But the key thing is they didn't go to which one they thought was the most important, which would be saying, oh, well, I better say this one. Which one is interesting? Which one is interesting? So it's a bit like whichever metaphor comes up. If you start saying to them, you need to do the right metaphor, pick the metaphor you think is going to be the best metaphor for now, that's going to kill the process, right? The idea is what's alive at this moment, okay? Where do you feel comfortable? And also with groups which have these contexts out there, it's also a kind of a safety thing. So the children don't know whose stories are whose, and you don't feel like you're, again, divulging, because you've got this idea of content free. Once you start putting stories, and they were putting stories of particular things, there is content there. So the idea is it was a fairly general story about a boy or a girl experiencing peer influence, and the idea is we put it around, and they would then actually make what we call body images. So body images is not totally dissimilar to Virginia Satir, and she was modelled, but Augusto Boal took some of that work and the work of Marino, who does psychodrama, and you basically make frozen pictures as groups, and they dialogued with their bodies, so they with these body images in silence. So it was getting it back into this silence. At that time, I didn't know of clean language. It was only and I'd started to hear about social panoramas, but I actually heard about clean language, funny enough, through a systems thinking group, because they use it in systems thinking. I didn't even know how it was being used in a more practiced way. But this idea of how to make non-verbal communication to get meaning happening without words, and particularly with groups, was what was the intentionality. And they actually use large group interventions in big organizations to help to brainstorm ideas and to get, they call it the whole system in the room, if you call it a system.
I do find that really fascinating. Like, I've never considered that groups past 15 people, like, you forget how many people are there, but just thinking about that as an idea. And it's like, essentially everybody starts to coalesce as a unit to create what's there. Obviously, there's their individual factors. And from a systems thinking perspective, they are part of the whole system. So it's quite interesting to see how it all sort of works together.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is where there's a bit of an innovation I was bringing in, was rather than thinking about a system, I was thinking about a social topography in this case. So in this grounded geographical landscape, they're in kind of a social topography, which extends as far as their awareness in that geography. And then that then can link into this, what we might call a system that we use, in more organizational terms. So there's this interesting thing, because the community were really engaging deeply. And I think we get a little bit of this in mental space psychology, right? It's really, really working, and a lot of it's going on. But to try and translate that into this language more systemic language, which people who aren't from that world get, is quite hard, right? So in this, because it kind of happens at that level. Once you go in, you're now talking about it at a completely different kind of way of making meaning. And the same thing was the case. So we had these really rich conversations, and they say, oh, and the idea was, how can we bridge that with these community facilitators and the local organization so that these different conversations can find where they need to go,
Okay.
and maybe influence enough.
So if I'm to translate that from what I've understood, essentially this mapping of like the social topography or where people see things in their immediate environment, what information, because it's part of the collective, right? Because everybody's doing it together. What can we extrapolate that for either systems or other organizations so that they can take, it's like, as opposed to taking a subjective view, this is right, this is wrong, that's the way to do things, that's the way. How can you look at everything and how it all interrelates? I mean, for example, I can foresee if there's a dodgy area of town, you'll know that from the type of fabric and the potential interactions, and obviously you talk afterwards. But by knowing those things, the stories don't necessarily need to be shared, but the insights can potentially be gleaned and looked at from a higher level, maybe.
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces there, yeah, and also from a lower level. So because we do have a kind of a preference for higher level, and this is where it started to get. So you're right, but what I realized though is that the stuff in the social topography, to some extent, you can't get it beyond there. There's a little bit that people who are kind of maybe the community facilitators or the outreach workers sort of know, but it's almost like you're in a different world. And this is where I then started to get into embodied cognition and embodiment, and that led into a whole. So what is going on when someone's in this social social topography or working in this fabric? And why is it that it can't necessarily travel up? And even when I spoke to some of the people at the community-based organizer, they said, oh, this is great. They're together, they're talking, they're enjoying, they're making all these conversations. Oh, could you just take one of them, and this is kind of brutal, but this is how they used to word it over there, and take it to one of our war rooms, and they would go and represent, because we have to represent all of this. Well, when you're representing it, it's no longer that. Does that make sense? It's no longer, the representation of what has happened in metaphor isn't what's happening in metaphor. And just like what's going on in the social topography. So this question then came up, well, how do we look at these different levels? And this sort of comes up a lot with these participatory processes. So I came up with something called infusion space, where we have like multi-meso level. So there's almost each level has its own mid scale. And they can relate when they're near each other. And in clean language, they talk about adjacencies. So there's the adjacent, and then there's just, to some extent, and this is where the diversity work and that can't really deal with it, is you can't teach someone equity and inclusion to understand what's going on here, because it's too distant, it's too contextual. It just is. So therefore, we have to find ways to bring and to work at multiple levels and start to infuse them. That was the idea. How can we infuse different ways of being and different scales? And in that meso, in metaphors of movement, you could call that the proprioceptive action space, where you've got thinking and feeling, and you've got that proprioceptive knowing. But of course, that's at a much more individual scale. And then trying to
So what's coming to me from that, a few different things. So I think I remember on training course I was on somewhere, they were talking about the people that you coach if you're a coach or therapist. And it's like, if you're like, let's say not great, you've just started coaching someone who's like got tons of money, is probably way out of your bandwidth. Similarly, but so it talks about how you can go slightly above or slightly below. And it makes me think of like cultures. If we think cultures, there are cultural containers, cultural awareness, and some people don't know what it's like outside of it. So by trying to move them to that place, they're just going to be clueless. So you can stretch the boundaries of those things, but it's a lot more challenging to make sense of those things if you're not in them. So what, if I've understood what you're saying, is you look at the different chunks as a whole. So that chunk of that community, then you've got, let's say, the organizational structures. You can look at that chunk within itself, and you can look at some of the overlaps, but to look at translating everything here up is just not going to work, because some of the things are just going to be too far apart.
Yeah, too far apart. And also there's granularity. So there's a difference, and there's just a level of granularity that happens at the local level, which is really the strength of the people there. And actually the interesting thing is, the person who is the homeless person who maybe like would come to the village to the wedding to get food, those people's experiences are almost the ones which are hardest to get. In a way, the most valuable people to participate are the most marginalized, because they're the ones it's hardest to guess their experience, actually, from a more, you know, a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of, in the sort of the green movement, they do a lot of these participatory workshops, and a lot of people gather who to do that. But a lot of them might be, you know, more from our sort of background, or maybe even more educated sort of doctors and people with quite high education. Now they're going to come together and they're going to have these green themed workshops, and they'll relate to each other because they kind of live in a similar life, you know. But it's a very different life to the people who've just come here, you know, or, you know, living in a rural area trying to survive, or are newcomers to Canada, don't speak English. So this is this ability to get into the context of and go deep. So there's an idea of scaling deep as well as scaling out and scaling up. Scaling up is scaling up to other forms of power, and scaling out is to scale your thing. Scale deep is to go in. And a lot of this work with large group processes in organizations was so that the managers could get deep into the, you know, they used it, you know, they might have 2,000 people. There's no way the managers can know what's going on for all those 2,000. So, you know, why not help them help you? Is there so that idea.
That's cool, and I can definitely see that from a variety of different perspectives, in the sense that, I mean, metaphors of movement, clean language, I mean, you need to speak the language, you need to know the idioms, but if you're using space, I mean, unless somebody is totally new to a place, they will know some of the geography, they'll know the good places, the bad places, they'll be able to map those things out. So it sounds like a really interesting system. And yeah, I think I'd be really intrigued, because also with fabric, from a metaphors of movement standpoint, and looking at an idiomization, you can look at how things are folded, how they're clumped, if they're flat, the height proportion relative to other things, and to be able to communicate or understand those things could offer a lot of interesting insight.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And actually, with the fabric, I often use energies. So that's actually came a bit from the Lucas Dirks work, even a bit more. So, but we do a lot of that in sort of drama workshops. So we actually do some passing energies around, and we just find energies and qualities in the room. And then when the energy is found, what color is it? And it might be that we actually have, now we do this work when we're doing the more creative side. So there's kind of two sides. There's the more mapping side, and there's a more sort of imagining possibilities work. So if it's just doing it with energies, it will be more imagining possibilities. The mapping or working with sort of a more defined space is the work that my organization, because I run a non-profit that was doing that, called Aiding Dramatic Change, AIDING, Aiding Dramatic Change in Development. So it's like looking at different ways to change the way we do development. And so, and a lot of it's about choosing the methods. Like, it's actually really hard. Like, I actually haven't done social drama topography for nearly 8-10 years. I've been trying to. The setup for it's quite hard. In South Africa, people do live in that local area. So if you don't have people with a real sense of the geography and the theme, it's not really it's not necessarily the method to use. So I've been doing other methods now. I did more recently, I did a one where I was actually deliberately trying to work across these different levels. Up at a local organization called the Neighborhood Organization here in Toronto. And I was doing a work with them around, it was a placemaking, digital placemaking and general placemaking project, and it expanded a bit on the side I was doing. I was sort of engaging the community, helping them get involved, doing some of these spatial activities. Some of the people were speaking Urdu, so it's a nice way in. Actually, I think some of these nice ways in with these spatial activities is almost like I'd love to have if I knew more people here doing metaphors of movement, I'd just love to bring people in, do some of these creative spatial stuff. And it's almost like you could tell, oh, you could do mindscaping, or you could do metaphors of movement, or you could, you could kind of, it's a bit like, it could be like an intake form, but a fun one, and it doesn't have to be.
Are there any fun intake forms, Stephen? Are there?
Well, I know that's true. Well, go around here.
Some people love it. Some people love it. No, that's really cool. I mean, I'm looking to put together maybe in a year or two, like a gathering of people in North America for the metaphors of movement and stuff that's adjacent to that, because I think there is so much space to explore, literally. But I think there's so many different avenues that you could take. So also before this interview, like I did a session with Stephen. So basically, the first time I reached out, we talked about metaphors of movement, mindscaping, clean language, and the differences. So just to segue slightly, it was really interesting having that session. So just in your words, Stephen, how would you define the differences between metaphors of movement, clean language, and the whole mindscaping side of things?
So this is a little bit on the, like, it gets kind of into the embodied cognition world, I think, in terms of how this is, but there's different scales from what I've noticed of working. So there is an interesting parallel, I find, between entering into the mindscaping process, where you do, and entering into the initial part of metaphors of movement. So metaphors of movement, as most people might know on this call, you elicit the what's ahead for you, what's right ahead and what's left ahead, what's up, what's underneath you, and what's behind you, or what's left behind you, what's right behind you. And there's some flexibility, and you work that out. And one thing, and I know that this is interesting, because I actually sent a message to Andy Austin and said, Andy, you got to check out this mindscaping. It's really interesting. He actually hadn't heard of it. And then they got talking, and, the community got going. But one thing that's interesting he found is in the mindscaping, a lot of it, and it comes out of this work that Mike Mandel did in Toronto. He's actually based here, around navigating your way to the future. So he kind of has that. That was a previous work that I didn't know about, but I heard that was what he was doing about 5-10 years ago. And then this became a sort of an evolution of that. But you're sitting on your chair, and you do evoke where you are, and you find a quality or a value that you want to bring into to explore, something you want to have, somewhere you want to go in the future. So it's a bit more future orientated. But there is this initial elicitation when you sort of pop up, and one of the main things that he's saying, and Andy found this interesting, is you see what is it that you would set aside. So in metaphors of movement, you don't necessarily have these as your sides,
Yeah, it's what's right and what's left, but they are.
That's the kind of part of it. Whereas in metaphor, in mindscaping, the idea is like, we're going to try and find the essential kind of the metaphor of the map. Although I've even used I was trying it with like Egyptian tombs, Egyptian hieroglyphic stones, anything that you could use to navigate away to a horizon. But the way they tend to teach it is they imagine unfurling a sort of a time-based map that goes out in front, behind you, underneath you, and you're sort of in that. So it starts to set the rules of the game in a way. So it is a bit, you're liking this, in a way, a bit like you could say metaphors of movement. It's establishing a little bit of the rules of the game that you sort of start to orientate to. Okay, you've got an idea that this, and some of it's also relates to how we view the world, right? So the past unfolds for mindscaping behind, the future ahead. but the sides are more like these are side issues. So the idea is we want to see what are the sort of essential things. The idea of the map in this case is like, and he makes a very particular point of it. It's the essential map that you might use. You know, like if you get a map of just the highways, it's just the highways, and then you get more detailed, or if it's a geological map, it'll be for that. So what are these essentials? And that's quite interesting, I think. And then beside you, you can have things that can be resources, but you're actually trying to actually almost pull stuff away that you don't need. And you don't really work with what's beside you. They're side issues. He literally calls them side issues. And then, you know, would you describe what happens next?
No. I think it's interesting. So I think the way, because you did a Mindscaping session with me. I mean, I'm definitely going to study the work, but I was curious about how it worked. So metaphors of movement working with experience. Normally, I mean, you can look at other aspects, but predominantly with experience, and then communicating that. So essentially, you're looking to shift, create change, or gain insight on the current situation of events. But it's not really future focused. It might highlight if there's a lack of future, there's a lack of direction, things like that. So the way I sort of see it is, if somebody was lacking direction, weren't sure where they needed to go, and they were a bit lost, Mindscaping could be a useful way of essentially, I mean, if you think about effective business, they talk about, well, what are the things that you don't really need? Like, what are the core things? Like, what are the must-haves that are 100% needed for this thing to occur? So by knowing where you want to go and focusing on what are the key elements, and if we think about well-formed outcomes in neurolinguistic programming, like you need to have multiple routes to get there possibly, or a few different options. But what are the core essential things? I think it could be quite interesting to see those things. And and I think the idiomization, I think, could play a very interesting role with that, as long as you don't push it if it goes too far out, because then you'll be into no man's land of explored possibilities. But I thought it was really interesting how it worked, and the sense that, similarly to metaphors of movement, as much as we explore a little bit from that central position, Mindscaping doesn't actually get you to move. It gets you to go higher to see the journey, but you're not actually shifting where you are from that reality. So from an insight perspective, I think it's highly interesting, but creating of movement, I'm not so sure if that's the case, because
I agree 100%. And actually, there is one thing that I found really interesting, is I almost think that very first elicitation is almost, even though he's not, is effectively like metaphors of movement. And effectively what he's doing in this case is he's kind of looking out, and he actually does change the metaphor a little bit. So you brighten it up to make it the right kind of landscape that you can then get up. And like you say, you effectively rise up, or imagine yourself rising up and looking down on your position, so you can get insight, or you can get a vision of that horizon, which you don't get in that down position. So it is almost, and I have heard, actually, because I was attending some groups, and I think during COVID, there were some doctors, you know, in the midst of COVID, it was a very difficult time. So someone was there and everything was really black and dark all around them. So actually what they did in that case was they actually literally got them to imagine getting up and moving like 200 feet forward. It wasn't actually Mike Mandel who said that, it was one of the people who were doing this with this client. But I thought it was interesting. So, you know, there is a sense of like changing the kind of space, but there could be times when, you know, you look to the horizon, but it may be that it would really work to have, you might be stuck. So there may be a case for doing more metaphors of movement.
I do think that's interesting, because, I mean, obviously the rising up, like certain timeline therapies, there is a dissociation. And as you lose those kinesthetics, you have more access to be more subjective, which is cool. Now, the interesting thing is, like this case with this doctor and everything's dark, like that was their current experience and situation. And obviously we came out of it. But would there be a way out of it? Who knows? I mean, God forbid things like that get worse. But that's interesting. But the point is, who cares? Does it serve the client in that context to make them more resourceful? Is the reflection. So it may be denying their initial reality, because it was a pretty rough time, I'm guessing, for doctors. but does it serve them to help them to be more resourceful within that context? Is the question and the debate.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yeah, I think so. And the point is to get a path to that future horizon and even be able to see it and see some is a bit more cognitive. I mean, it is a map. It is more looking at, and this actually comes back, if we're going to start comparing these things, this issue of time, like time is a big part of, or the idea of speeding up. And there's a question about what is time and how does time, because one thing you can do if you have an issue in part of the times of the Mindscape is you can actually make time speed up or slow down. So you've got a building, you can actually allow the building to age away. You can sort of play with time in a way that, and then this comes back to, and I think we're kind of playing with this in the level 6 work and sort of some sort of hypotheses that we're putting together, what is time? There's a massive question generally in physics and all sorts around time. And, time can be a construct that we lay on things and it's useful. And it's not necessarily actually out there. And that temporality is out there. Maybe something happens in a sequence. So there's about sequencing. Something did happen, something's more like happening, and something's in the future. But the way that we scale that happening, it's like watching a cat when it gets something jump at a cat. It's like for a cat, it can see a snake coming towards it, and it just literally goes like this. Whereas for us, our reaction time is like a sixth of theirs. 6 times longer than theirs. So for us, we just don't see anything. We don't know how the cat can even do it. But for a cat, time is, and they're not thinking in time, but their experience of how
it's how they experience the world and the filters that they put on it that structure it in a certain way. And obviously our language creates our time a lot of the time as well.
Absolutely.
And I think time is a huge discussion, which I think could be in a whole other video, to be fair, because I think there's so many aspects to it. Now, you obviously, we talked a bit about mindscaping, and metaphors of movement is really great at shifting perspective and really communicating in ways that our conscious mind can understand our unconscious experience. And that's why I love it. That's why I train it. That's why I'm so passionate about it. But then we've got clean language, which works in a very similar environment, but it doesn't really use that language. So how do you see clean language working with? Because I mean, they're really good modalities in themselves, but they're different. So when might you, for example, choose to use clean language? For those who don't know, clean language has 7 questions that explore this sort of spatial proprioceptive environment, but it's just those questions to open stuff up and to allow the client to gain awareness. So, but more as well. But what would you say is the difference from your side, Stephen?
I would say that the more it's going to come from an embodied experience and building out from that, the more I would go with metaphors of movement, because it's for me it's working very much with in ecological psychology you have something called affordances, and affordances are opportunity for action. Okay, so this pen doesn't write, this hand doesn't write, this pen with this, it comes together and it co-constitutes an affordance to write. Obviously it also needs my brain and me, but this ability to pick up a pen and start to write, and we can say that with a cup of tea. So the reason I say that is because this is my sort of own theory a little bit of how I sort of read it, but is metaphors of movement is working more inactively with the affordances of what's in the landscape coming at me. So if there's a tree in symbolic modeling, the tree is in the name, symbolic modeling, right? It's more symbolic, right? And in the same way that the sort of symbols and the original symbolic modeling was more working with trauma. So in that case, the symbols are in the body, or let's just say the felt sensations in the body, and then we sort of try to get a feel for it by people eliciting a metaphor. So people, and as you know, David Grove actually, who developed the methodologies and the processes in the 80s that led, and the clean language questions, and that which led into the symbolic modeling, coding of that by James Lawley and Penny Tompkins. Andy Austin also had chances to meet David Grove, and he was inspirational in Andy's thinking. So there's a direct lineage piece, but there's also you know, it's a bit more. It was initially, I think, like I say, working with trauma and work like that, because he was working with Vietnam veterans and really quite challenging child abuse cases. But he was also very playful in going out and doing stuff out in caves and stuff in America, David Grove. But Andy's work, I think one thing that I found interesting is maybe it's a bit more what I would call psychodramatic and metaphors of movement. It's a bit more like you're kind of there, right? I mean, you don't have to. You can be sitting on your chair. Sometimes it's quite nice to stand up and be and feel it. And clean language is, I would say, is a bit more working with the language scape. So the words are more in the language scape, and you just keep unfolding it and unfolding it. And Andy, I think he was sort of joking a little bit and poking a little fun at clean language, but I think he's backed off of it because it can wind people up if you do that too much. But basically, what if you don't know? This is the question. What if you're kind of struggling? In clean language, there's the big question is what would you like to have happen? What wants to happen next? And there's this kind of unfolding, a biological unfolding of intentionality and knowing. And that kind of is revealed through the words. And then what happens? And what would like to happen? And if that happens, what happens just before that? And those questions are really useful when working with fabric. You know, I say, what size and shape? So if I have a community member who's non-verbal and they can only move their eyes, and they say, and they literally can point to they have an energy, and which color is it like? So I might have this and a few other yellows, and they signal to I actually throw them down. Which one? This one, this one, this one, this one. Okay. If it was this one, and has it got a size and a shape? Is it bigger, smaller, bigger, smaller? And you can start to work with clean language to sort of get the essence of the qualities of what something is. Okay. And it's quite a lot of it's about what it is. And my work with infusion, and I think also more with metaphors and movement, is there is the what component, but where does that start to play out in that kind of action space? So when you're doing an idiom, in a way, you're not really going on. So in clean language, it might be there's a wall. And what kind of wall? Is there anything else about wall? Has it got a size and a shape? And when wall, what happens? And they might say, I'm stuck. And you carry on processing what is out there, what these different entities are in and I think this is true when you talk about your idioms, is where I work a lot with where that happens when I'm doing these grounded activities, but also what kind of affordances for action, good or bad. You know, I've got an arrow coming at me. It's not so much about the symbolism of the arrow, because you've got rate, duration. What's the other two? You know,
direction, distance, mode, and rate.
Right, that's it. Yeah. So it's coming. You know, this then is it's froze. It's kind of not playing out like a story, but the rate at which something's going to happen is important, and that's why I believe that idioms work in metaphors of movement, because it's basically idioms in a way. To some extent, it's a little bit different to accidentally having metaphors in the question, which is not the same as an idiom. But idioms can be the same sort of idea. It's like, well, that's the whole point of clean language, is not to do that, right? But you can do that in metaphors of movement, because it's not about what you're trying to you're trying to shape the kind of the action space or the potential for action, and maybe that action is something, or the inability to act, or the ability to act and provoke that a little bit. So that's where I think that there's a little bit of a difference there. And so when I do my workshops when I do my work with the communities with disability, and I'm going to do this event, is I actually do I sometimes ask them what's ahead for you, what's behind a little bit, but mostly I use clean language there because it's a diffuse space. There is no real, the person could turn around. There's not really a front, back, forward.
Yeah, or given the context, also given the amount of people in the environment, unless you, let's say, set it up in a more formalized training style, you layered in stuff and did that. But if you're doing it in a less formal, more fun, more collaborative, more creative space, it's a lot easier to use those kind of questions because they are more content free, so to speak. It's a lot. Okay, that's interesting. And one of the interesting, go for it.
Just one other thing though, the one thing I did experiment just around COVID, which I wanted to be able to do, and I'd love to try this actually with you sometimes, is like a metaphorical forum theatre. So what I do is like it's a person who's do their experience, and this actually probably would be a bit more metaphors of movement. So when they're stuck or something, what was in front, maybe a bit more idiomized than the pure metaphors movement. But so for instance, I had someone, he was presenting a workshop, and remembering a time when it was difficult, and he was presenting, it was actually a forum theatre performance. He was a forum theatre facilitator, and it was something was going wrong with the audience or something. So he said that it felt like he was like trying to climb up a wall, rock climbing, and he was looking down. It was really difficult. Yeah. So I said, okay, so you're there. So what's left, what's right? But we actually started to extend out the wall, if it's going down, and what might be behind you, and actually start to have characters come in and actually make a play out of the metaphor. And then you could run the play, if that makes sense, as a participatory theatre piece, which should be really fun. Yeah, it went quite well.
We love a bit of drama.
We like a bit of drama, exactly. So there's actually a group called Imagine Action. I know there's a guy, Hector, he's actually in Colombia, and they're based out in Italy, but they're sort of getting up and running again. But it'd be kind of a fun fusion actually, because normally the challenge in that community is none of them know clean, right? So I'm in this kind of, it's a bit of a weird one. You kind of need to know some of how this works, and metaphors, right? But I think there's a lot of room for some moving around, and outside of there's the more strict workshop, and then there's stuff which is especially once you've got groups and stuff, then you can move between more kind of creative expression to therapeutic to therapy. And we don't, and then they get into the question of when you're contracting. So my challenge in some ways is when I'm doing my work is I'm almost creating spaces where you create an informal invitation, but you're not creating a contract.
Yeah,
in a way.
I mean, I just had an image of you in like a laboratory, like a wizard with a cauldron, and communities like, okay, what are we putting in this potion, people? Let's make it beautiful. Let's take a bit of clean. Let's take a bit of clean. Let's take a bit of metaphors. Let's get some bit like topography. Awesome. And I think this is why I love this work. And I mean, I'm really into the idiomization and the metaphors, but because working with the unconscious is such an abstract and challenging thing to do, there's multiple different ways to do it. And just given the nature of the unconscious being so expansive, the amount of overlaps that will come up with these modalities would be really interesting. So, I mean, if you have a modality like that, you deal with the unconscious, or you're interested, or you want to touch base with Stephen, feel free. Reach out to me or Stephen. I mean, he's more than happy to have a conversation. I'm happy to do the same. I'm sure if you like this, give it a like. If you'd like to have further interesting and wacky conversations with myself and Mr. Sillett, it'd be great to have. But before we go, have you got anything coming up? I know you're in Toronto, right? So do you just do work there? Did you work elsewhere? What sort of bits you got coming up?
Yeah. More recently, it's sort of redoing work here. And we're doing this event called Come to the Edge, where we're working. Originally, that came out of the work with the communities with disability, but it's going to be now done. And we wanted to just share that with the public, and in a way where the relationship between the public and the community member with disability didn't make them a spectacle. Okay, so just like I mentioned before, that whole mapping thing was a prelude to doing a participatory theatre piece.
Gotcha.
There's going to be at Todmorden Mills, which is in the East York area of Toronto. We're going to be animating that historic site. It's part of the Toronto Arts Council grant, and so people are going to be outside connecting to the area, and we're going to come in and we're going to become part of what we call the Come to the Edge fabric speakeasy. So we actually have got an actual immersive theatre fabric set of interactive activities where you get to the edge of your knowing. So that's going to be interesting. You'll find about, so this is almost like a club where you're asked to go to the edge of what you know. And then once people are invited and ready and they choose their fabrics, materials and stuff, we take them into this other part, which actually is another part of what was an old 1820s mill, one of the oldest buildings actually in Toronto from the colonial part. And in there, we're going to do that creating worlds. And that's when people will come in there and they'll start to explore, and it gets quite trippy, I have to say. So it's good. It's the first time since COVID as well. So if anyone's in Toronto,
is it a public event? Is it paid? Like
it's a free event. You need to just register. There's some limit to the capacity of how many people we can take on the journey, but we're going to be doing it on July 3rd, July 4th, and July 5th. And there's also options there actually for animating that space to be able to run some workshops. So I might be using the space to run some sessions, and might be some stuff happening in Toronto around that. Maybe Dale, you can come up and do something. Be fun.
Hit me up. I need to check with the missus. But yeah, that sounds cool. Well, if you want to check that out, do. It's really been great talking to you as always, Stephen. I'm sure we will talk again. But thank you so much for being here. And as always, guys, keep on taking steps, and we'll catch you at the next one.